What's up, nerds? My name is Steve from Flipping the Nerd, and this is my top 10 favorite Steves. Yesterday was my birthday, so I decided what better way to celebrate my birthday than to make a list about some of my favorite Steves in the world. Myself excluded, of course. Probably wouldn't even crack the top 10 anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So I thought it'd be a fun list to do, and I happen to be lucky. I have a name that is associated with a lot of awesome people, so it would be a fun list, and I'm excited to do it. This list comprises both real and fictional Steves, so it's going to be a mix of the two that I'm doing here, and let's just see how it goes. So without further ado, let's hit up some honorable mentions. The first one is Steve Ditko, who is the co-creator of Spider-Man, among many other Marvel characters. Steve Ditko co-created Spider-Man along with Stan Lee. I don't know a ton about him, which is one of the bad things about this whole situation, is that a lot of people don't know a lot about him. A lot of people just talk about Stan Lee as being a creator of a lot of these characters, but in truth, Steve Ditko had a lot to do with it as well. Of course, Stan Lee is one of my absolute heroes, and I had to at least give a shout out to Steve Ditko and just pay my respects to a man who co-created one of my favorite characters of all time, if not my favorite character of all time. So respect to Mr. Ditko. Then we go on to Steve Buscemi. Steve Buscemi is an awesome actor. I absolutely loved him as Mr. Pink in Reservoir Dogs. He was great in The Big Lebowski. He was amazing. It was in Fargo, right? That he was. I should have probably checked, but yeah, he's just so good in so many movies. He's hilarious. He's got such an iconic look. That's what I'm going to call it, an iconic look. And I'm always happy to see him on screen. His latest venture, I don't know, maybe he's done something more recently, but he was someone really big in some crime show. Of course, I'm like blanking right now. I'm just so excited. I'm going on vacation. It's my birthday. It's everything. Oh my God. Anyway, he's on a great show right now. Boardwalk Empire. I'm like losing my mind. So Steve Buscemi had to be an honorable mention as well. Then we go into a fictional character, Captain Stephen Hiller. Captain Stephen Hiller is Will Smith's character in Independence Day. I adore Independence Day. It's such a fun movie to watch. It's probably one of my favorite disaster films of all time. It might also be one of my favorite alien films of all time. It's just such an epic movie, and Captain Stephen Hiller is one of the main characters in that movie. And one of the biggest reasons I didn't like number 2 was his exclusion from that movie. It was such a bummer that Will Smith couldn't reprise his role in that film, and they killed him off in such a terrible way that I at least wanted to pay respects to the man and the character. Great character, great movie, and deserved at least an honorable mention. Then we go with a blast from the past in the 1990s, Steve Urkel. Steve Urkel was the neighbor to the Winslow house in Family Matters, which was a TGIF show back in the 90s. I absolutely loved Family Matters. It was one of the shows I used to watch the most in the 90s. I always look forward to TGIF, so Steve Urkel was a hilarious character at first. The problem with Steve Urkel, and why he's only an honorable mention, not my top 10, is that he was good in small doses. But eventually the show started being all about him and not about the family, and I really liked the family. So Urkel kind of ruined the show in the end, but for the first 2 or 3 seasons, when he was used sparingly, he was hilarious, and I absolutely adored him, and that's why I wanted to give him an honorable mention. And finally, we have Steve-O. Steve-O is someone I know from Jackass. He's known from a ton of other things like Wild Boys and some doctor show. And he was the craziest guy on Jackass. It's something I loved in my adolescence and something I still chuckle to this day. I know it's kind of one of my guilty pleasures in life was watching the Jackass stuff. And Steve-O was a big part of that. I always assumed he would die first. Unfortunately, Ryan Dunn was the one who died first and the only one who passed away. But Steve-O actually cleaned up, and now he does really great interviews. He does a comedy tour, and he's really like changed his life around, and that's really inspiring. I listened to a lot of his interviews, and he's well spoken. He's got great stories. So if ever you want to go down a great YouTube kind of rabbit hole, I would recommend watching some Steve-O interviews of the last few years. So that's my honorable mentions, and let's get into the top 10. Number 10, Steve Martin. Steve Martin is an actor. He's known for things like Parenthood, Father of the Bride, and a bunch of other movies and stuff. Steve Martin was just one of those guys I loved watching in the 1980s. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is another one that I really like with Steve Martin. I always felt he was old because he had white hair, but then he like never aged through like the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And that was really weird. He's so funny at like his like kind of deadpan humor, how he's always like annoyed and stuff. And I just absolutely love watching Steve Martin movies. He's one of the iconic actors from the 80s and the 90s. And I thought he was definitely deserving of a spot on the list. Number 9, Steve from Minecraft. Probably didn't expect this one, huh? So Minecraft is my favorite game of all time, and the main character's name is Steve. How appropriate. Now Steve, of course, the character, there's nothing much to him. He's just basically a figure that you use. You barely see him because you're usually play in first person. But just the fact that my favorite game in the world has the main character called Steve, which I didn't know until like the toys started coming out also. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. And he should probably be just an honorable mention when I really think about it. But because it's my favorite game of all time and the main character is named Steve, I just feel such a pride about that for whatever strange, stupid reason. But I do, and that's why I put him on my top 10, not on my honorable mentions. And he's sitting here at number 9. Number 8. Dr. Stephen Strange. Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange is a character in the Marvel Universe. We've seen played more famously recently by Benedict Cumberbatch in Doctor Strange movie and the Infinity War series, Endgame stuff. I always liked Doctor Strange as a character. Now, he's not always great in the comic book. Sometimes he's a bit too much of a dickhead, but I do enjoy most of his appearances. I really dig his look. I like his storyline. I will have like a cartoon, like animated movie of Doctor Strange, which I really enjoyed as well. His movie was great. He was a great addition to Infinity War. We didn't see him as much in Endgame because he's one of the people who had been snapped. But I do appreciate this character very much. I think he is a worthy inclusion into the Steve Club, and that's why I put him on the list. Number 7. Steve Harrington from Stranger Things. Steve Harrington is an interesting character on Stranger Things because he went from probably one of my least favorite characters in season 1 to one of my favorites by season 3. Steve Harrington has had a really interesting character arc, and I really dig that about him. He really went from a dickhead bully in the first season to starting to understand more of what the other people were going through at the end of the season. In number 2, he was paired up, and it was just such an amazing... with Dustin, sorry, I should mention that. With Dustin, and they had an amazing chemistry, and he started defending the kids from the Stranger Things. And by season 3, he's just like full-blown awesome and friends with the other crew, and his whole like Scoops Ahoy thing with Robin was just fantastic. And his character was hilarious. He was often in the best scenes of season 3. Definite highlight. And if you want to see me talk about season 3, cheap plug, check out the podcast that I'm on called 3 Guys That Horror. You can find it on most podcasting services. That was a really fun episode to record, and it's one that I'd like you to listen to if you are interested in podcasting and horror and stuff, which obviously I am. So Steve Harrington, definite inclusion in my top 10. Number 6. Steven Spielberg. Now, this one was a bit of a point of contention with me. He moved from my honorable mentions to my top 10, back to my honorable mentions, back to my top 10, because I hear a lot of stories of him kind of being a dick now. He hates like stuff like Netflix and on demand and VOD, and that's kind of weird for a guy who had promoted film for so long. I guess he just wants theater releases. It's a whole thing. I don't want to really get into it. But when it comes down to it, I do have to respect his work because he put forth some of my absolute favorite movies of all time. We're talking Indiana Jones, E.T., Jaws, Jurassic Park. Like, there are so many Steven Spielberg movies that I absolutely adore. Even one of his latest, Ready Player One, was fantastic, and I really, really like his work. So I had to include it in my top 10, regardless of what he's like in real life, because he's such an iconic director and he's made such amazing films that have been part of my childhood, my teens, my adulthood. The guy is fantastic and an amazing director. One of the best who's ever lived, in my opinion. So I had to put him on the list here at number 6. Number 5. Steve Irwin, the Crocodile Hunter. I loved watching The Crocodile Hunter in the 90s. It was a way to get to see kind of animals that I don't get here in Canada. Spoiler, there's not a lot of stuff that can kill you in Canada. Maybe bears, but I mean, you have to be more in the wilderness to see those. So to see things like tarantulas and snakes and crocs and all sorts of stuff, it was just so cool to see Steve Irwin presenting that and showing a respect for nature that is so important. It's something that I've really brought with me into my adulthood. I respect animals so much, and I think a big part of it's because I watched Steve Irwin growing up. In fact, I said it often, you can kill people all day in horror films. I really don't care. But if like an animal even gets hurt, I'm like devastated. It just devastates the crap out of me. I feel animals, should be protected and stuff, and Steve Irwin was a big influence of that. It is so unfortunate that he passed away tragically by being stung by a stingray. I'll never forget learning about that. It was such a tough moment. My friend Gabby had texted me, and I wasn't even sure. I was drowsy. I was just waking up, and she texted me saying, "Oh my God, Steve Irwin died." But the way I read it was, "Oh my God, Steve Irwin died." And I was trying to figure out who the hell's Irwin. I have no idea who Irwin was. And then when I started waking up, it dawned on me that she meant Steve Irwin. And it was such a bummer. I'm glad people like Coyote Peterson, who I really respect as well, and you should check out his YouTube videos, are kind of taking that mantle and that message and bringing it forward to a new generation. But respect to the man from the 90s, the Crocodile Hunter, Steve Irwin, and that's why I put him on the list. Number 4. Steve Rogers, aka Captain America. If I told myself 10 years ago that one day you would have such an affinity for the character of Captain America, I would say that you're lying. Because honestly, I never really liked Captain America in the comic. It's only when I started playing video games and seeing animated movies where I started getting what Captain America was all about. And that was brought way forward when it was played so brilliantly by Chris Evans in the movies. The Captain America movies are some of my favorites in the MCU. I mean, Winter Soldier is in my top 3. Civil War is in my top 5. I mean, Captain America movies are awesome, and Captain America as a character is someone I've really grown to like, and I'm so happy that I got to really understand this character. I really thought he was just a propaganda piece, but he's really so much more than that. He's not a propaganda piece. He just does so much good, and he's so wholesome, but in a way that's not too much. Kind of Superman, which I'm not as big of a fan of. So Captain America definitely deserved a spot on my list. Number 3. Stone Cold Steve Austin, whose real name is Steve Williams, so it's a double Steve there. Stone Cold Steve Austin, I mean, I was the biggest wrestling fan in the Attitude Era, as most teenage boys were. If you were a wrestling fan, it was probably in the 80s or in the mid to late 90s when the Attitude Era was in full swing. And the Attitude Era would not have happened if it wasn't for this man, Stone Cold Steve Austin. I used to look forward to watching Monday Night Raw every single Monday. I would never, ever miss a show. And you never knew what this guy was going to do next. I mean, when that glass broke, who knows what was going to come out of the other side? Was it just going to be Stone Cold to open a can of whoop ass? Or was it going to be a Stone Cold in a beer truck or in a Zamboni? Or wheeling out Vince McMahon in a wheelchair dressed as a hunter? You never knew week to week what Stone Cold Steve Austin would do. And I now appreciate him even more because his podcast is fantastic. He's a great interviewer. I just listened to an interview with him and Hulk Hogan, who unfortunately they never crossed paths. And I think that's the biggest star of the 80s and the biggest star of the 90s. And it was such a cool interview, and there's so much to like about Stone Cold Steve Austin. I just watched him on the YouTube show Hot Ones, where he eats hot wings and gets interviewed, and he's just such a cool guy. Or you ever see his video where he's comparing fruit, he rates fruity drinks? Fantastic. You should watch that too. Stone Cold Steve Austin is an absolute legend. I ran into him in a parking lot one time, and he was super, super cool. So Stone Cold Steve Austin, definitely part of the list. Number 2. Steve Carell. Steve Carell is maybe my favorite TV character of all time, with Michael Scott on The Office. The Office, of course, if you look at one of my very first videos, if not my very first video of the top 10s, was my favorite TV shows, and The Office was number 1. Spoiler. And my favorite character on The Office was Michael Scott because he was so funny. I quote Michael Scott all the time. He was cringy. He was hilarious. You felt sad for him. You were mad at him. This character was just so much, and he was so fantastic. I was just telling another Steve, actually, Steve from Geek Out Cinema, check out his channel, that I've only cried twice in my adult life. Once when my grandmother passed away, and second time when Michael Scott left The Office. Oh my God, when him and Jim are saying their goodbyes, I actually shed a tear. And up until that point, I never cried as an adult. Now, of course, my grandmother passed away and that made me cry, but other than that, I've never cried as an adult. So that shows you how much I feel about that character, Michael Scott. So Steve Carell, and he makes great movies too. I mean, let's not forget all his other stuff. 4-Year-Old Virgin was fantastic. Date Night was fantastic. Evan Almighty, not a great movie, but he was great in it. Even his serious roles, that Sunshine one, not Little Miss Sunshine. Oh my God, you know what I'm talking about. I forget the name of it. It's got some long weird title. That one where he's there's 7 or 8 hours to live before the apocalypse happened. Steve Carell is just so great, and I absolutely adore the man. I love The Office, love Michael Scott, and that's why I put him on the list. Number 1, Stephen King, the king of all Steves. Stephen King has such a big influence in my life as a horror fan, as someone who used to read his books. I say used to because I don't read it too much anymore. I just don't have the time for it. But Stephen King has brought forward so many of my favorite movies and my favorite characters in the history of cinema and literature. My favorite book of all time is The Stand. My favorite movie of all time is The Shawshank Redemption. It is a fantastic story as well, and Green Mile, which was him, is one of my favorite movies of all time. There's just so much The Shining, there's so much. Stephen King had such a huge influence in what I like about pop culture that I had to put him at the top of my list. His stories have really influenced my life. I love, if something says, this is a Stephen King joint, they don't say it like that, but if it's a Stephen King story being adapted into a TV show or a movie or a miniseries, I'll watch it. Just because it says it's from Stephen King. It might be terrible. It's happened. But I'll still watch it just because it says Stephen King. So, yeah, Stephen King is a fantastic author, everything. I'm so happy that I even have, so I have a Stephen King room in my house that I have so much stuff for that I actually had to move it to a bigger room. So that's what I'm doing right now. And I'll show it off one time, just like I did my Haunted Mansion room. I'll show this room at some point too. But my Stephen King room has a ton of stuff. It's got a ton of art signed. It's cover art of his books signed by the original cover artist. I have a ton of those. There's just so much, and there's so many things that I can collect that are Stephen King related because the guy is so iconic and stuff. So Stephen King, you are the man, you are the king. I can't wait to finally meet him in October, which is like looking like a good possibility that I will. Yeah, Stephen King had to be at the top of this list. I'd love to know whether you're a Steve or not. What are your favorite Steves in either fictional or real life? I'd love to know, so let's discuss it. And yeah, that would be awesome. Next week, I'm going to do my top 10 favorite childhood TV shows. That is 1989 and before, because I am a child of the 80s. And that was a real, I've already recorded it and I've already like posted it because I'm going to be away when it's released, so I like kind of pre-did it. And that was a really fun list to do, a fun one to talk about, because I loved watching TV when I was a kid, and I love to reminisce about shows I used to watch in the 80s. So hopefully you can join me for that one too, and check out the other videos on my channel if you'd like. I mean, I did a top 10 Stephen King movies adaptation, which kind of relates to this list, top 10 TV shows. There's a bunch of other lists that I've done. Thank you again to everybody who watches this. I appreciate all of you so much, and I hope you can put in some comments so I can have, chat with you guys. I would love to do that. So that's it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all on the flip side.